Hey LFC, welcome to our first week of our fall semester of life groups. I'm really excited as we get to start a new book of the Bible as we look at the book of Amos. Amos is an Old Testament book. A lot of people seem to be unfamiliar with the book, so tonight I just want to give you some historical context of what's happening so that you can have a better idea and a better understanding of what you're reading. And it's important to go through a little bit of history as we start tonight's lesson through the book of Amos. And we all know that God had established the nation of Israel, these 12 tribes coming from the sons of Jacob, who would become to known as Israel. These 12 tribes are formed into a nation by God. And God establishes a king within this nation. We see King David as the greatest king in Israel's history. And God makes this promise to David that as long as your sons walk in my law, I will make sure that you have a son reigning in Israel for all eternity. And eventually there will be one king who will reign over an eternal government. And David would go on to have a son named Solomon, who would be king after him. But Solomon's sin leads in Israel into a great state of despair. We see that after Solomon dies, the kingdom splits. The nation of Israel splits into two nations. We have the northern nation of Israel that consists of 10 tribes, and then you have the southern nation of Judah consisting of 2 tribes. And we see the southern nation of Judah, they do okay, they do well. They have a few good kings periodically throughout their history. But the northern nation of Israel is a mess. They never have a good king. They're constantly struggling with idolatry and sin, and their nation is just corrupt and vile and wicked. And what we see is through Israel's history, God would send prophets to the north and to the south. These prophets, these messengers of God, we could look at as being covenant mediators. And what they would do is they would come to the nation and say, look, you guys know the covenant that you agreed to at Mount Sinai, and you guys are breaking it. You guys are in sin, you've disobeyed, and now God's punishment, his wrath is going to come. And if you don't repent, then this wrath is going to be poured out on you. And we see that Amos is one of those prophets. He's from the southern nation of Judah, but it's interesting in that God sends this southern prophet to the northern nation. He goes north to Israel. And what's really interesting is there's only 2 prophets who go north to Israel, Hosea and Amos. If you look back into the Gospels, if you look ahead into the Gospels, at one point somebody asked Jesus, what's the 2 greatest commands? What's the greatest command in the law? And Jesus responded, they are to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind and your strength. And the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. And when you look at Hosea, he comes to Israel to tell Israel how they failed to love God. And Amos comes to tell Israel how they failed to love their neighbor. It's important to note that when Amos goes to Israel, they're actually in a time of great prosperity. Other nations are busy handling other affairs, and so Israel and Judah, they're left to themselves, and they are prospering. But what we see in Israel is the wealthy are very wealthy, and the poor are very poor. In fact, the wealthy has corrupted the system to where the wealthy stay wealthy, and the poor stay poor. And Amos comes to Israel really seeking to show them that they failed to love their neighbor well. And if they want to avoid God's punishment, they need to establish justice. It's what he says here in chapter 5, verse 14. He says, seek good and not evil, that you may live. And so the Lord, the God of hosts, will be with you, as you have said. Hate evil and love good, and establish justice in the gate. Later on in chapter 5, he makes this famous verse. He says, but let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Amos was seeking to get this nation's attention that they need to love their neighbor better. Amos is an interesting prophet in that he's not just a typical religious leader. Amos was from the south, and he was a shepherd. In fact, he probably managed a lot of different shepherds, and we also see that he managed kind of a fig tree garden, and he was probably middle class in Judah. Wasn't poor, wasn't rich, but just this middle class shepherd, kind of rough around the edges. He's a bit sarcastic at times, but he comes with this very important message. And the message for us today is, how do believers, when they're living in a land that appears to be wealthy, that appears to have it all together, that appears to be heading in the right direction, how do believers love their neighbor in a nation that's really corrupt, that is really unjust, where people don't love their neighbor well? And so it's an important lesson for us today. And tonight I just want to take some time to reflect on the prophet Amos. Consider his past. I want you to read some verses talking about who he was as a man, as a prophet. And I can't wait to get into the rest of the lessons, and I'll see you next time.